Welcome to Proto-Germanic Revivalistics. Today's topic is orthography, that is possible conventions on how to write revived Proto-Germanic. My goal here is to present suggestions that hopefully without much hindrance will let us parse a written text and which shows us how to read it aloud, even if we at first perhaps don't understand its meaning. Keep in mind that there is no Proto-Germanic language board that will issue a fine for real or imagined slips of the pen. You can and should decide for yourself how you want to write Proto-Germanic, and no matter what you opt for, the risk of being misunderstood owing to your orthographical preferences will be minuscule. This is the second version of this video, and I want to thank for the feedback I've received on Discord. I hope I've addressed the shortcomings that were kindly pointed out to me, and I also hope I've at least to some extent managed to improve the presentation of the rest. I'm never happy with anything I record, so don't consider any video I upload on this channel to be final. Indo-European proto-languages are, as a rule, written with the Latin or Roman alphabet extended with diacritics, and their orthography follow most of the phonological or morphological condition sound changes. This is a sound practice, and there isn't really any good reason not to follow it. We don't want to guess how things are pronounced, so to the extent it is reasonable, we want to write phonemically. That's not to say that other alphabets or writing systems can't have their place in the context of revived Proto-Germanic. And towards the end of this video I'm going to think aloud a bit about writing with runes, but until we get there the Latin alphabet will be our focus. We will start with looking at diacritics, that is all the little squiggles we add to what we can call our vanilla letters as we meet them in English. These are necessary if we want to have a usable writing system that assists our reading. We'll look a little closer at each, but we'll begin with an overview. For vowel length we have the macron, the circumflex and sometimes the double macron. For primary and secondary stress we have the acute and the grave accent marks. For hiatus I personally use a dot below. For nasality we can encounter the ogonek, the tilde and the superscript n, and somewhere someone quite possibly just writes out the consonant n and leaves it to the reader. When talking about Proto-Germanic phonotactics or word formation we might want to use a few more conventions. Among these are the brev, just to make it clear that we are talking about a short vowel. On morphemes in isolation, I might use the grave accent mark to indicate what once upon a time was pre-Proto-Germanic stress, as that can cause changes in preceding consonants. I may or may not use it in future videos. If you don't find it useful, just ignore it. If a simple stop has arisen through shortening of a geminate, Kronen 2011 shows this with a superscript stop. This is useful when you want to know how a certain word has been derived. For example, deopaz, that is deep, with a superscript p, does not indicate a pronunciation differing from deopaz without it. The superscript letter just tells us that this stop has been shortened. On to the macron. This is the horizontal line we can see above a vowel, and it tells us that this vowel is long. More or less everybody uses this as long as they can type it. In older literature, such as Falkentorp 1909, you will instead see the circumflex, which looks like a roof. You might recognize this from Welsh if you live in or near or have ever visited that beautiful country. If possible, and it nearly always is, you want to stick to macrons. The reason you want to do this is that if you want to mark quote-unquote overlong vowels, then I believe the circumflex is what everyone uses online, granted that everyone in our context isn't really a huge number of people as far as I know. An alternative to the circumflex for overlong vowels is the double macron, which is used in Ringe 2017. It's easy to write on your mobile if you have an app for making your own custom keyboard, but less easy on your stationery. Even if you don't pronounce overlong vowels in any of the possible ways that has been suggested for their realization, or maybe don't even assume their existence, it might still be a good idea to use the circumflex as a grammatical diacritic in the ending for the genitive plural, just for the sake of clarity. A didactic diacritic we can encounter for vowel length is the brev. This looks like a little bow, and it just tells us that a vowel is short. A brev and a macron combined tells us that a vowel can be either short or long. Primary stress is marked with the acute accent mark and secondary stress with the grave. In handbooks on Proto-Germanic I believe I've only seen these marked when stress happens to be under consideration. Now, Proto-Germanic stress is completely regular and predictable, but just because something is regular doesn't mean it's obvious, especially not when you're learning a language. Not all languages where stress is phonologically relevant mark it, and that can be an obstacle. Even if you are a native speaker, it's easy to go awry if you encounter an unfamiliar word. But if it's marked, you always know how to pronounce it, even if you cannot yet parse the structure of the words in front of you. In a Proto-Germanic simplex, primary stress on the first syllable is so regular and common that I don't believe it's necessary to mark it. But if the primary stress falls anywhere else but on the first syllable, I always mark this with an acute on the peak of the nucleus in the stress syllable. In a compound, the primary stress always falls on the root of the first member, and the secondary stress always falls on the root of the last member. Here I always mark the primary stress with an acute and the secondary stress way down the line with a grave on the final member. this might at first glance seem unnecessary, but if you're facing a compound with words you don't already know, especially if it has 3 members or more, it really helps in parsing what you have in front of you, and it will assist in getting the intonation right if reading aloud. In a quasi-compound where the prefix/suffix member is still quite recognizable as a noun or an adjective, I mark both the primary and secondary stress just as if it was a compound. In quasi-compounds with nominal prefixes, I have a habit of just marking the primary stress on the outermost nominal prefix, but not the secondary stress. This is admittedly inconsistent. Maybe it would be good to mark both. I don't know, I just haven't felt the need to. Occasionally, for the sake of clarity, even if the primary stress falls on the first syllable, say in alone, I might still mark the primary stress if it in any way might look tempting to place it somewhere else. Hiatus is what we have when 2 vowels, which do not belong to the same syllable, are adjacent. For this, and I just came up with it myself because I felt it was needed, I use a dot below the vowel of the second syllable. I didn't think about it at first, but there is of course a parallel in Gothic where this is done with the trema, that is 2 dots, above E. Marking hiatus prevents us from misreading adjacent vowels as diphthongs, which has happened to me when I was snookered by the spelling of some words in Lithuanian. I'm somewhat wavering whether or not to use this dot below uniformly, even when the vowels that meet can't be mistaken for a diphthong. Mostly I do. Sometimes I ask myself if I really need to. In handbooks we can probably encounter at least 3 ways to mark nasality, 2 of which are unprepossessing. Of those 2, the first one is the tilde, that is the little way we use to mark nasality in phonetic and most likely also in phonemic transcription, and the other one is a superscript n. The one I use, which thankfully is also the most common one seen on the internet, is the ogonek. This is the little hook you see under vowels here and there, most often finally. As I've mentioned elsewhere, if you want to pronounce them nasally, then by all means you should. If you and I could converse relatively unhindered in revived Proto-Germanic, their presence or absence will make no difference whatsoever. If you pronounce them, then the ogonek will be a phonological diacritic. If you don't, it will be a grammatical diacritic. In writing, the ogonek will in either case assist us in filling out some of the context we would have had if we had been speaking to each other face to face. To a lesser or greater extent, the context always suffers somewhat in writing. Redundancy when communicating through writing is never a drawback. That's the reason why we today use full stops, commas and question marks. So if we see an ending with an ogonek, however you pronounce it, we can narrow down, for example, what case a noun or adjective stands in a little bit easier. And that's even more important if you are into arranging words around to fit a poetic meter and such. A quick word on how to type with all these squiggles. Depending on your mobile, it can be easy as pie to write vowels with macrons or ogoneks, that is, just press and hold, but I've been reminded of that it unfortunately doesn't work on every model. However, if you use an app to make a custom mobile keyboard, you can combine whatever diacritics you want, and it nearly always also looks good, double macrons included. I use an Android app called Keyboard Designer. This is not a paid advertisement, and I don't know the developer. I'm mentioning it because it's made my life much easier. With Keyboard Designer, you can design as many keyboard layouts as you need, all with swipes and pop-up menus and what have you. And if you need to add something to your keyboard mid-typing, you can do so. On screen now I'm just showing a capture of some usable and some unusable glyphs that I can now write on my mobile with no effort whatsoever. If you are using some other app that you prefer, feel free to leave a comment here or on Discord so that others can have some options and see which suits their needs better. By your stationery, the absolutely most laborious botheration to go about marking the so-called overlong vowels is with the double macron, as in Rinch 2017. It's possible, but I'm not sure it's worth it. If you're using Windows, I've also learned that we can make our own keyboard layouts with Microsoft's Keyboard Layout Creator. I haven't tried it myself, but I really should. Currently I switch between a Swedish, Icelandic and Lithuanian layout as well as skimming through the glyphs, which is a bit tiring. Regarding graphemes, there is some variation that we encounter in dictionaries and handbooks. The phoneme ch can be written either with an H or an X. While using an X makes sense, I just don't think any one of us is used to that, and anyone reading aloud a word such as hauchas or hauchas written with X's without being familiar with Proto-Germanic is likely going to read it as xauxas. You'll have to take my word for it that it can happen. The most common letter used for this phoneme is H. The phoneme th is nearly always written with the letter thorn. Voil's 1992 is an exception, and it's a real eyesore. In older literature, such as Elias Hyssén's Svensk språkhistoria, as well as in Oral 2003, and you have no idea how difficult it is to pronounce 2003, you can meet the letter ej for the phoneme g. But another of the things I learned on Discord after I posted the first version of this video is that this use might have its history in the insular G, from which also the Middle English letter jog is derived. Even so, what we seemingly often see in print, and what I once upon a time also saw being written on a whiteboard during class, is however indistinguishable from ej. I wouldn't recommend using it, as today it's the IPA symbol for the sound j, and that's also how someone familiar with linguistics or speech therapy and such, but not historical Germanic linguistics, will read it. If you really don't want to use a vanilla G, maybe consider insular G and jog before j. For the labiavelars, there is the unappealing option of using a superscript W. You can see this in Ringe 2017 and Voiles 1992. You might have considered using Huer for Hua and Q for Qua, but then just like it's lacking in the Gothic alphabet, what would we use then for Gua? Also, if we want to have a single grapheme for every phoneme, then we maybe want to consider graphemes for sk, st, sp, if we count those, and I'm not sure if anyone would want to jump on that train. Being that there likely were no difference in pronunciation between the labiavelars and the equivalent clusters, and not even Falkentorp's dictionary from 1909 has qua or hua as separate headings, I'm quite happy using digraphs. The only thing we need to remember with digraphs is that a root, such as sech, si, phonemically has the root structure consonant-vowel-consonant and not consonant-vowel-consonant-consonant, but that's not difficult. If you want to show allophonic variation with their own graphemes, you can for example use hxng, and for fricative allophony maybe bdg with a stroke, though I think that will look more like corrupted data or scribal errors. In its own way it might seem quite appealing, but I don't believe there are any benefits to it. Regarding hyphenation at the end of a written line, there isn't much to say. We're already used to placing them at a syllable boundary, and at least as far as I imagine that I know, that is also what disturbs the flow of the reader as little as possible. If you're writing on Discord, then this goes out the window anyhow, as I don't believe anyone is going to bother with it. When it comes to punctuation, I'm just going to say that I favor syntactical punctuation. In modern Swedish, something called tydlighetskommentering or clarity punctuation is in vogue. I don't like it, and I believe calling it anything else but vagueness punctuation is newspeak. Syntactical punctuation requires some grammatical awareness, but language is something we learn throughout our lives, and one shouldn't feel ashamed to say that punctuation can be discombobulating once in a while. I don't, and I'm too tired to care if anyone should try to pick on me for it. I'm pretty certain I overuse the comma where the mutton dash would be more suitable. If you're learning a second language, or just write a little from time to time, your grammatical awareness will improve, just as your style and vocabulary will improve with practice. As much as I'd like to use punctuation marks for irony, doubt, conviction, sentence clusters, paragraphs, arguments, pieces of discourse, and whatnots, I'm not, and I haven't decided on anything for myself. But if punctuation is something that interests you, there is a book by Parks, 1992, that might be fun. The title is Pause and Effect, an introduction to the history of punctuation in the West. Regarding the alphabetical order of revived Proto-Germanic, I failed to mention in the first version of this video that what I really was thinking aloud about was lexicographical order and not really alphabetical order. Alphabetical order isn't that relevant for us, as none of us interested in writing in revived Proto-Germanic are starting from the alphabet song. But if we had done so, we would have wanted a convention for the order of plain short A with an ogonek, and A with a macron. When it comes to lexicographical order in a printed dictionary, we have two reasonable and two unreasonable options in front of us, all of which, believe it or not, we can actually meet in print. Naturally, Z doesn't have its own header in any of these, as that would have been an empty page. The two reasonable options are between whether we should or shouldn't discriminate between short and long vowels, and the two unreasonable options are Germanicized Devanagari order as in Falkentorp 1909 and a runic Futhark order. There is an old dictionary with the latter, which I once was browsing through a long time ago in a library that I no longer frequent, but I cannot for the life of me remember who wrote it. I don't think it was a hit anyway, as it didn't catch on. It should perhaps also be mentioned that Falkentorp's dictionary is ordered with word families under their respective roots, which is also something I prefer. I have not seen a lexicographical order for Proto-Germanic that discriminate between labiavelars and their equivalent clusters, and I don't think that would make sense for us either. Regarding vowel length, if we regularly met with new Proto-Germanic words in speech, then knowing whether to start looking onwards from, as an example, short e or long e might possibly be a challenge from time to time, but that's not going to happen anytime soon. When you meet a new word in writing, discriminating between vowel length in the alphabetical order might speed things up, marginally, unless you forget to take vowel length into account, which you likely will. Then it will take longer. Looking at a good Lithuanian English dictionary, such as Piesarskas and Svetsavich's 2002, we can see that vowel length isn't taken into account. Despite the fact that I am prone to splitting hairs, I feel I must give way to the Lithuanian lexicographers. They have a lot on their plate to deal with, and we can assume they have thought through the matter long and carefully. Of the aforementioned four options, I favor the unreasonable Germanicized Devanagari order, because it's the only arrangement with some phonetic reasoning behind it. If we consider electronic dictionaries, it wouldn't be a biggie to let the user choose whichever lexicographical order they prefer. Even my favorite Germanicized Devanagari order arranged into word families. And even that runic Futhark order, for which there undoubtedly is going to be someone who want to insist on it but never use. Once upon a time I learned some JavaScript for the sole reason that I wanted to code an electronic Proto-Germanic dictionary, and I did. I might come back to that sometime in the future in another video, though it doesn't work anymore. Stuff has apparently happened with browsers and what have you. We have reached the perhaps somewhat more nebulous and less structured final chapter of this video on orthography. Here I just want to share a few thoughts on writing with our relatively popular runes instead of the Latin alphabet in the shape we've just covered. Looking at the history of runes, we meet a variation that persisted throughout the very long time they were, or perhaps I should say have been, in use. Now there is a long tradition of teaching runes by pigeonholing certain allographs into various runic alphabets. This is what we see when we meet rune rows called the Elder Futhark, or the Younger Futhark, or the Medieval Futhark, or the what have you Futhark. But speaking of rune rows with particular shapes of runes in this way is a modern construct, and they are a tool for us when we try to understand a material with plenty of variation. Unfortunately, these have effectively caused many to mistake the map for their terrain, so to speak. If you've had an interest in runes for a while and have tried on your own to learn more about the subject, it might not be unfair of me to assume that the chances are not insignificant that you have encountered a lot of, should I say, strong opinions on what is quote-unquote right and what is quote-unquote wrong when it comes to runes, their shapes and how to write with them. But if you want to write with runes today, it really isn't difficult. If anyone wants to convince you of otherwise, my sincere advice would be to continue your pursuit of knowledge elsewhere. It's an alphabetic writing system, not quantum field theory. And while the study of runology offers many captivating challenges on many levels, just writing with them today isn't one of them. From a linguistic point of view, runes as they are somewhat suboptimal. Important features such as, for example, vowel length, stress, hiatus, and for a period of time even the distinction between voiced and unvoiced consonants haven't been or aren't satisfactorily represented. But I, and quite apparently a whole lot of other people, still enjoy writing with runes on, for example, Instagram. Personally, I do this not because I am all wild about runes per se, but because it is a way for me to contribute at least a little bit to keeping the diversity of writing systems in the world alive. For it is as simple as that. What we don't use, we will lose. And what is lost, we become ignorant of. And with ignorance, misconceptions and enmity spread all too easily among us. And for every writing system we lose, even if it isn't of the same gravity as the loss of a language, the world also loses some of its beauty. To wrap things up, if you want to write revived Proto-Germanic with runes, you should, if it brings you joy. Likewise, adapting runes in some way is perfectly fine too. Apart from all variations we already meet in inscriptions, there are even more beautiful shapes of runes in later manuscripts, possibly compiled just for the sake of it, even if they weren't in wide use at any point in time. Right now they're just sitting there on their pages, and I at least don't believe they'd mind being brought back to life. You can create a completely new conscript for expressing yourself in if artistic expression and not readability and communication is your priority. And you can experiment with medieval scribal practices of the Latin alphabet. If paleography is something you enjoy, just looking at facsimiles of Old Norse manuscripts can be absolutely droolable. Whichever you do, you can be certain of that you are contributing to keeping our existence on this side of the veil a more interesting, and, at least in some sense, magical place. After this higgledy-piggledy advocacy of diverse packaging of linguistic material, if I may have any wishes on whatever you decide to do, they would still be the same as what my aim is for the orthography we covered earlier. And that is, if your writing system is phonemic, then you and everyone else can only benefit if all relevant phonological features are clearly marked. But that's just me, and it says something about how I experience the world around me. My processing of experiences doesn't always make it easy for me. Often it's the opposite, and sometimes it has made me suffer greatly. So while I imagine that what I suggest you in these videos are reasonable, just take it for what it is. Good intentions. Until next time, be well.